The air inside the abandoned storage loft felt colder than the winter outside. Not the kind of cold that came from weather, but the quiet, settled chill left behind by years of sealed dust and undisturbed shadows. Light from the investigator's small torch traced slow arcs across the warped wooden floor, catching on debris, glinting off the rusted rails of an old pulley system. Time held its place here, patient and unwilling to move. Every sound, or lack of sound, fed the stillness. Even the smallest shift of dust seemed too loud, too alive, as if the room objected to intrusion. These first 100 words were meant to pull the reader inward, into a space where the past had not simply ended but had instead waited. And in that waiting, something fragile lingered, an echo of a day in 1996 when the quiet had been broken for the last time by the fall of a life that, even now, refused to settle fully into memory. Her name was Liora Halden, 28, a graphic archivist at a small Midtown photography institute. Not widely known, yet deeply respected by those around her. Friends who described her as gentle, methodical, someone who loved old paper, antique lenses, and the solace of small exhibitions. She had moved to New York from Vermont 3 years before the day she vanished, searching for opportunity and a sense of belonging in a city that rarely slowed for anyone. Instead, she became a case file that never resolved, a set of pages that grew brittle with time. Detective Rowan Hale stepped deeper into the loft, his breath steady, eyes tracing every faint discoloration in the wood as though reading a script imprinted by pressure alone. He remembered the original scene, the long strip of muted daylight that had once stretched across the floor, the chalk outlines, the strange vacuum of noise that followed the initial chaos. He remembered how young he had been then, mid-30s, restless, ambitious, certain that truth always lay directly beneath the surface. He had been wrong. The memory played in subdued fragments. The call, the rush to the location, the stiff silence of first responders unsure how to speak when the scene felt heavy beyond description. Leora's body had been found near the far wall, her position ambiguous, her expression calm in a way that investigators could never fully interpret. No sign of struggle, no clear indication of motive. Evidence was thin, scattered, sometimes contradictory. And as the months progressed, the path toward resolution dissolved until the case froze completely. Now, 29 years later, Rowan returned, not with certainty, but with an old ache resurfacing from somewhere he thought he had silenced. He knelt by the spot where she'd been found. The faint smell of dust, metal, and something older, dry paper left too long in darkness, still hung in the corners. He pressed a gloved hand lightly against the floorboards. The wood, aged and fragile, creaked under even the lightest pressure, as if protesting the weight of past errors. A whisper of his own voice edged through memory. "We'll find the truth. We always do." He had said it to Leora's brother, who had waited for answers that never came. Rowan let his breath settle. His torch illuminated a strip of faded paint, a faint green mark from something long forgotten. Back then, they had photographed it but dismissed it as irrelevant. Another oversight, another ghost. This place was full of them. He stood again, scanning the loft with deliberate precision. The building itself was scheduled for demolition in a few months. A new development, a new skyline, a new chance to bury the past under fresh architecture. But he wasn't letting this room fall into silence a second time. Not now, because after almost 3 decades, the case had stirred again. Something new had emerged. Something small, but potentially devastating. And the reason he was here tonight was because, after so many years, the stillness around Liora Halden had finally cracked. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It began with a box. A simple cardboard storage box, mislabeled, misfiled, and sealed beneath other neglected containers in the basement archive of the Midtown precinct. A young clerk found it during an inventory update. She recognized the case code by chance, an alphanumeric string that appeared frequently on training materials for notable unsolved investigations. Rowan received the call on a morning without weather, sky flat, traffic steady. He listened to the clerk's hesitant description. "It's old, looks like original evidence. There's something inside that doesn't match the catalog." The catalog from 1996 had been an imperfect record. Missing items were common, misplaced ones even more so. Still, Rowan felt a small inward shift, as if a dormant hinge had suddenly clicked. When the box arrived on his desk, he examined it in silence. The cardboard had softened from age, edges peeling. The label, faded but legible, read, "Halden Storage Loft, 21496. Inside lay objects he remembered: a broken pencil, fragments of photographic film, a torn ledger page, old dust-coated fragments of what might have been packaging material. But there was something else now, something that had not been listed, photographed, or mentioned in any report. A single undeveloped photo slide, still sealed in a protective sleeve, still intact, still untouched. His gloved fingers lifted it with slow respect. The slide frame bore a code, not Liora's handwriting, not the Institute's catalog system, a code he had never seen before. It suggested the photo belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had been present in that loft, or near it, close to the time of her death. Rowan placed it against the light. The faintest silhouette emerged, blurred by the unprocessed film. A figure, possibly two, a beam of light, some structure behind them. But it was the timestamp, written in small ink across the top, that stilled him. 2/14/96, 1842. Exactly 12 minutes after the estimated time of Liora's death. He felt the room around him narrow. His pulse remained steady, but a slow gravity pulled at his chest. Evidence introduced decades after the fact was often misleading. Contamination, misplacement, guesswork disguised as documentation. But this slide felt different, because it shouldn't have existed at all. He moved it aside carefully and scanned the rest of the box. Nothing else seemed unusual. No documents that suggested tampering. No new handwritten notes. Whoever had placed the slide inside did so long ago, perhaps around the time the box was first sealed. Yet no one had mentioned it, ever. The first inquiry he made was internal, checking the chain of evidence records. The old digital logs were incomplete. The physical logs were yellowed and difficult to interpret. The name most frequently attached to the early reports was Officer Darren Cole, Jr. at the time, now retired in upstate New York. A quiet man, precise, unassuming. Rowan remembered him vaguely, always meticulous, never inattentive. Had Cole found the slide? Had he placed it there? If so, why hide it? The official findings from 1996 had highlighted lack of motive, absence of witness statements, and no traceable items linking anyone clearly to the scene. The loft had been a rental unit used sporadically for art storage. No fingerprints had matched anyone of interest. No recent visitors had been recorded. The case went from active to cold in under a year. The slide changed that. Rowan sent it for careful processing, instructing technicians to maintain absolute preservation. Digital enhancement would take time, hours, maybe days. But while he waited, he returned to the stillness of the old loft, this forgotten upper floor where Liora spent her last moments. This was how the reopening began, not with breakthroughs, not with dramatic revelations, but with the slow return of old dust and old questions. He walked the perimeter, observing the scuffed beams in the far corner, the narrow window with its cracked pane, the faint outlines of boxes long since removed. The scene had aged, but the silence had not. It carried the same weight, the same incomplete story. Near the western wall, he found an old metal bracket, rusted thin, screwed into a support beam. He remembered it vaguely, a mount for hanging storage cables, possibly part of the old pulley system. But beside it now lay a tiny scrap of adhesive tape, brittle but distinct. New? No. Recent disturbance? Hard to say. The torch beam passed over a series of faint scratches on the floor. He knelt, inspecting them. Probably from furniture or equipment, but something about the angle felt off, too straight, too intentional. He photographed everything, documenting each mark calmly, carefully. No assumptions, no conclusions, just the clinical rhythm he had learned over decades. There was no comfort in the process, but there was clarity. When he exited the building, evening had settled. Wind moved loose debris along the sidewalk. The streetlights flickered faintly, struggling against the gathering dark. His phone buzzed as he reached his car. A message from the photo lab. Slide developing, something visible, will update soon. The words were bare, but his response was slower, thoughtful. He stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. It had begun again. And this time he would not treat the evidence like mere remnants. They were fragments of a life, a voice silenced too early, a story unfinished. The past had returned, and he intended to listen. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Rowan's office felt smaller than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed with a constant low vibration, barely audible but persistent, creating a thin tension in the room. Case files from 1996 were spread across his desk, beige folders, printed forms, handwritten notes in fading ink. The dust along the binder edges showed how long they had remained untouched, how prone memory was to selective silence. He switched on a desk lamp, warming the area with a muted glow. The smell of old paper, dry, slightly sweet, reminiscent of museum archives, rose as he unfolded each document. A quiet weight settled around him. The weight of patterns missed, moments overlooked, statements accepted too easily. He began with the initial discovery report, the time of call, the arrival of first responders, the layout of the loft, the early assumption that Liora might have slipped and fallen, an idea dismissed within hours once inconsistencies appeared. Next came the forensic summaries. No signs of forced entry, no signs of prolonged struggle, very faint marks around her wrist, too indistinct to classify. A partial thumbprint on a metal box near her belongings, unsuccessfully matched. Rowan paused on that page. Back then, fingerprint databases were limited. Now, decades later, even old partials might lead somewhere if digitized properly. He marked the page, setting it aside for reprocessing. He moved to the interview transcripts. Friends described Liora as calm, deliberate, someone who rarely rushed. She spent long hours reviewing photo archives, fascinated by moments frozen in light and texture. Her supervisor recalled she had borrowed equipment that week, nothing unusual. No conflicts at work, no documented disputes. Then came the statement from a neighbor, a musician who lived one floor below the loft. He had heard a soft thump like something dropping around 6:30 p.m. At the time, investigators believed the sound aligned with her fall. But Rowan noticed something now he had missed before. The musician had also mentioned hearing a second sound, softer, maybe footsteps. In 1996, the detail had been dismissed as ambience from the hallway. Tonight it felt different. He read a line again, and again. Each time the words seemed to shift, quiet, almost embarrassed to reveal themselves after so many years. There were more fragments. A janitor recalled a man waiting near the freight elevator earlier that day, unidentified, described only as calm, tall, wearing a dark coat. That detail had led nowhere, overshadowed by lack of corroboration. More missing pieces. More ghosts. Rowan lifted a report listing objects found near Leora's belongings. Contacts book, wallet, photo samples, a small metal case containing negatives labeled with institutional codes, but none matched the slide discovered in the basement box. He felt something tighten in his chest, not emotion but recognition, a shift in logic, a small thread weaving itself into place. Someone had been with her, someone who handled photographic equipment, someone whose coding system did not match the Institute. He checked the list of people with access to the Loft in 1996. Only 6 names, all previously cleared, but one stood out now, the Institute technician responsible for processing archival photos. A quiet man, rarely interviewed beyond a single session. His report was brief, almost too concise. Rowan read the line. No knowledge of unauthorized use of loft space, no involvement. Short, controlled, curiously restrained. He moved through more documents, his focus steady, his thoughts methodical. The rhythmic rustle of paper seemed to echo faintly through the room. After hours of review, he leaned back, tracing each conclusion with calm deliberation. Something small had always been missing, a detail so ordinary it slipped past everyone. The evidence had never been incomplete. They had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Snow drifted lightly against the precinct windows the next morning, scattering thin patterns of frost across the glass. Inside the conference room, Rowan arranged old case photos in a deliberate sequence along the table, faces, transcripts, fragments of evidence and locations layered in a slow, analytical rhythm. It felt almost ritualistic, as if inviting the past to stand quietly in the room again. The newly developed slide lay at the center. The technicians had enhanced it overnight. A blurred figure near the loft window, turned partly away, a second shadow behind a stack of crates. Not distinct enough to identify, but clear enough to confirm one truth: Leora had not been alone. That single confirmation cracked open a set of possibilities once considered unlikely. And slowly, the case widened. 1. Aaron Venn, the coworker with quiet frustration. Aaron had worked alongside Leora at the Photo Institute. He'd been ambitious, eager for recognition, often overshadowed by her meticulous nature. Back then, interviews described him as polite, cooperative, perhaps slightly reserved. But Rowan noticed something now. His alibi had been solid only because it was supported by a supervisor who later left the city. The supervisor's statement had never been revisited. Rowan reopened Aaron's file. Notes mentioned a minor disagreement between him and Leora weeks before her death. Nothing heated, but enough that colleagues remembered discomfort. Something about responsibility over missing negatives, a misfiled archive entry, and an equipment checkout dispute. Was it motive? Not necessarily, but it was tension, and tension mattered. The enhanced photo slide showed the first figure wearing something that resembled a work apron or equipment vest, the same type used at the Institute. Rowan stared at the faint outline. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. 2. Diana Merrow, the neighbor who heard the soft second sound. Diana lived 1 floor below at the time. A musician, often practicing late, distracted, but attentive to ambient noise. Her statements revealed a kind of intuitive listening, able to distinguish footsteps on old wood, the echo of shifting objects, even differences in elevator rumble. Rowan reviewed her transcripts. She described Liora warmly, nodding that she'd occasionally heard her humming while unpacking photo crates upstairs. Diana had no clear motive, no documented history of conflict. But there was an entry in an officer's margin notes, barely readable ink, almost hesitant. Diana mentioned knowing someone who had access to building back entrance, unclear connection to case. It had never been expanded, never followed another thread. 3. Technician Elias Rourke, the quiet operator of the darkroom. Elias processed most of the Institute's archival work. His file was surprisingly thin, efficient, silent worker, rarely absent. No recorded disputes, no unusual behavior. Yet his coding system for negatives didn't match the slide found in the box, and that difference itself raised questions. Rowan studied his interview transcript. Short answers, minimal elaboration, a tonal flatness that could be ordinary or could be concealment. Hard to say. Elias had claimed he left the Institute at 5:45 p.m. the evening of the incident. No witness confirmed it. Cameras at the time didn't cover every exit. His alibi relied on routine rather than proof. Rowan found himself lingering over this line in the notes. Elias states he has never used the loft and prefers the main darkroom. No reason to enter storage area. Yet the slide had been captured in the loft, near the window. Another quiet contradiction. 4. The unidentified man at the freight elevator. The janitor's statement from 1996 mentioned a man waiting near the elevator sometime around late afternoon. Calm, tall, wearing a dark coat, nothing else recalled, no interaction, no additional witnesses. Rowan compared the description to the faint shapes in the slide. Impossible to confirm. But the angle of the blurred figure near the crates, straight posture, hands lowered, hinted at a composed stance, not someone startled or trespassing. He created a separate file for this unknown figure. No motive, no history, a blank space that carried weight precisely because of its absence. 5. Officer Darren Cole, the one who handled the evidence box. Rowan hesitated before adding this final name. Cole had been reliable, steady, respected, but he was also the one who cataloged evidence the night the box was sealed. He was the only person with access before the box was moved to basement storage. If he had found the slide and included it quietly, why omit it from the log? Was it a mistake? A deliberate decision? An attempt to protect someone? Or something simpler, a detail he couldn't interpret at the time? Rowan didn't want suspicion to cast a shadow over a retired officer, but investigative neutrality demanded it. He added Cole's name to the suspect board with slow, reluctant motion. 5 suspects, 5 sets of motives, some faint, some uncertain, some emotional, some structural. None could be dismissed outright. He leaned back, letting the interconnected patterns settle in his mind. The slide, its timestamp, its angle, its presence, was the axis around which every suspect now rotated. And still something felt incomplete, not missing, just not yet recognized, a detail waiting to surface. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next 2 days became a quiet storm of methodical work. Rowan revisited the loft repeatedly, each time tracing a different path, window to crates, crates to wall, wall to pulley system to floor scratches. He observed everything with the same controlled, investigative calm that had defined his years in the force. He moved slowly, allowing silence to carry its own form of truth. The process slide was now pinned beside a fresh series of high-resolution digital enlargements. Technicians had isolated the faint symbols on the slide frame, not a manufacturing code, not an institute catalog number. It resembled a personal marking, initials perhaps or shorthand. 2 characters. Lior. Rowan stared at the notation. Elias Rourke. The technician. A coincidence, unlikely, but assumptions could distort logic and he refused to lean into speculation. He cross-referenced the Institute's equipment checkout logs for February 1996. A pattern emerged. Elias had borrowed a portable slide camera on the exact day of the incident. The record was incomplete, missing a return timestamp. Why would a darkroom technician borrow a slide camera? Why on that day? Rowan marked it as a pivotal clue. Next came the floor scratches. He asked a structural expert to evaluate them. The expert suggested they were likely from a heavy object dragged a short distance. The angle was narrow, the distance small. Something moved only briefly, possibly repositioned. Rowan compared the scratch pattern to the enhanced slide image. The blurred second figure stood exactly where the scratches aligned. Someone had moved something to block or access the window area before the slide was taken. Another link. Then there was Diana's statement. Rowan visited her current address, a quiet co-op in Queens. She welcomed him politely, an older woman now, her voice softer, her presence reflective. Her recollections were fragmented by time, but one detail surfaced gently. I remember a conversation, someone asking me about the back entrance once. A man, I didn't think it mattered. Do you remember his face? Rowan asked. A pause, a faint shake of her head. No, only the tone. He asked if the entrance was usually locked. I think he said he was visiting someone upstairs. I didn't know who. Rowan's mind mapped the detail. Someone unfamiliar with the building's access points. Someone preparing a route. Possibly the unidentified man at the elevator. Possibly someone else entirely. Next, he revisited Leora's personal background. Her friends described her final weeks as calm, focused, ordinary. But one friend, a curator, recalled something unusual, a strange tension in her voice a few days before the Loft incident. When asked, Liora had said only, I found something in the archives, something strange. I'll figure it out. No explanation followed. Rowan searched the Institute's old archive catalog. On February 11th, Liora had signed out a set of negatives connected to a restoration project. Among them was one that had been refiled under ambiguous classification, MISC, uncertain origin. The code matched the faded marking on the slide discovered in the basement box. The threads tightened. Emotion, logic, conflict, movement. Someone had been worried. Someone had been cautious. Someone had been watching. Piece by piece, the emotional undercurrents surfaced, not dramatic, not loud, but quietly weighted. A technician guarding a secret. A coworker feeling overshadowed. A neighbor sensing unease she couldn't name. A retired officer carrying something he never voiced. Yet despite the growing web, Rowan kept circling back to one simple, precise truth. The slide existed because someone wanted that moment recorded. Not erased. Not forgotten. Recorded. It was the smallest detail, but sometimes the smallest details were the most devastating. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The twist did not arrive suddenly. It formed through accumulation, quiet discrepancies that slowly aligned into clarity. Rowan spent the evening reviewing Officer Darren Cole's early evidence logs, cross-referencing handwriting samples. The more he examined them, the more he noticed something subtle. Cole's writing style differed from the ink used on the slide frame. The initials on the frame, E.R., were not Cole. They were also not Elia's works. The lab confirmed it. The dash between the letters was unique, slanted upward in a habit characteristic not of Rourke, but of someone who handled technical labeling regularly yet informally. Someone who marked personal items out of routine, but not out of official duty. Someone like Liora herself. Rowan froze. His breath remained steady, but the thought pressed sharply against the edges of logic. If the initials belonged to Liora, it meant the slide was hers. If the slide was hers, she had been photographing someone else in the loft before her death. The timestamp confirmed it. She captured evidence minutes after the moment estimated for her fall. Meaning the estimated time of death had been wrong. Meaning she survived longer than originally believed. Meaning she had time to regain balance, reach the window area, and attempt to document her attacker. Rowan returned to the enhanced slide. The blurred second figure behind the crates, its outline was faint, but the shape of the shoulder, the slope of the neck, the posture, all suggested a narrower build than initially assumed. Not tall. Not the elevator man. Not Elia's. Not Aaron. Someone smaller. Someone who had been there that evening. Someone whose presence was assumed innocent. Someone who knew the building intimately. Diana. The musician. Rowan felt the realization settle slowly, silently. Her statement about footsteps had been cautious. Her recollections incomplete, softened by time. But her access to the back entrance, through a visiting friend years earlier, explained her familiarity with the building layout. The janitor's vague memory of a tall man could have been misinterpreted, a coat, poor lighting, passing glance. The emotional conflict, though subtle, surfaced in old interviews. Diana admired Liora but spoke with a hidden tremor, a suggestion of jealousy, not romantic but personal. Liora's quiet presence above her, her constant focus, her late-night activity disrupting music sessions. Small irritations, long-standing tension between floors. Rowan revisited the scratch marks in the loft, the dragged object, the sudden movement, someone attempting to block the window or reach the crates. He compared the approximate height of the blurred figure in the slide to Diana's height from her old ID record. It matched. The twist was not dramatic. It was quiet, plain, logical. The least suspected person, gentle, aging, reflective, had been the one closest to the truth all along. And she had lived beside the silence for decades. When Rowan approached Diana again, she sensed the shift. Her eyes moved away, her breath light. Fragments of dialogue broke the calm. You found it. Something. What happens now? We follow the evidence. Nothing loud, nothing accusatory. Just the slow, inevitable weight of truth. The interview room felt suspended in a kind of neutral stillness, neither tense nor calm, just quietly expectant. Its muted walls, faint hum of ventilation, and soft reflection on the metal table created an atmosphere that discouraged anything but plain truth. Rowan sat across from Diana, not with aggression or pressure, but with the same restrained, investigative steadiness he had carried since the day the old evidence box reappeared. His manner held no accusation, only a gradual unearthing, like brushing dust from a buried frame. Diana's hands rested lightly in front of her. No trembling, no defensive posture, just a tired composure. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, softened by the weight of years. "I didn't plan anything," she murmured, eyes unfocused as though looking slightly past him. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I only went up there to ask her to keep the noise down. The crates, the shifting things. I had a performance the next day." Rowan listened, silent, the way investigators listen when they already know the direction truth is traveling. "I knocked," she continued. She opened the door. She looked tired, like she'd been working for hours. There were papers everywhere, film boxes. I stepped inside because she stepped back, just enough that it felt like an invitation. She paused, her breath unsteady but quiet. Rowan did not interrupt. "I told her about the noise. She apologized. She always apologized, too gentle for the space she lived in." Diana swallowed, voice thinning slightly. Then she said something about a picture she'd taken by accident. She seemed unsettled. She said someone had been in the loft earlier. That's why she was staying late. She thought she'd captured something in a slide she processed. Rowan noted the detail, filing it into the internal structure he'd been building. "I told her to show me. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess." Diana's hands shifted slightly, barely perceptible. She picked up the slide from the window and turned toward the light. That movement, I don't remember how it turned into an argument. Maybe I said she was imagining things. Maybe she thought I was dismissing her. Voices rose, just a little, just enough. Her gaze lowered to the table. She stepped back near the crates. The floorboard under her was loose. I knew it was loose. I'd heard it creak for years. When she shifted her weight, it gave slightly. She reached out. I reached too. But I touched her arm wrong, pulled too sharply. It wasn't an attack. It was panic. She slipped, fell sideways. Diana closed her eyes, as though trying to cage the image somewhere behind her eyelids. She didn't fall far, but her head struck the edge of the metal bracket on the wall. The sound was small, too small. She didn't move after that, not at first. The air in the room felt thinner. Rowan maintained his still, clinical presence, not cold but steady. I didn't know what to do. I tried to help her sit up. She was breathing shallow. She said something quiet, something like the slide, keep it safe. I didn't understand. I didn't understand anything. Then she went still. Her voice cracked faintly before settling back into a controlled whisper. I panicked. I moved the crates, tried to create space. That's what made the floor scratches you found. I didn't want anyone to think I'd been there. I used the back entrance because I didn't want to pass anyone in the hallway. The logic aligned with the small, quiet truths Rowan had uncovered. No dramatic motive. No elaborate scheme. Just a convergence of tension, misinterpretation, and fear. The type of human fracture that often lies hidden beneath assumptions about clear intent. You took the slide, Rowan said, his voice low, calm, almost neutral. Diana nodded. Because she told me to keep it safe. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to throw it away. I didn't want to be the one who made her story disappear. So I slipped it into the evidence box when the officer was distracted. I thought, someday someone would see it. Someone who understood what she meant. Why not come forward? Rowan asked, not accusatory, simply a necessary inquiry. I was afraid, she said, at first. Then the days passed, then weeks, then years, and the longer it went, the more impossible it felt. The silence became part of living, not comfortable, just settled. Her explanation carried the soft erosion of guilt, slow, quiet, enduring. Rowan remained still for a long moment, letting the words sink into the quiet of the room. The logic was sound. The twist lay not in deception but in simplicity, two people in the wrong mood at the wrong moment, colliding with the fragility of old floorboards and misplaced assumptions. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was human, small, devastating in a restrained, understated way. Later that evening, Rowan wrote his final report. The keys on his desk were spaced deliberately, the rhythm steady as he translated Diana's confession into formal documentation. The administrative tone felt strangely detached from the emotional weight he carried, but it had always been his role to relay truth in a structured language, free of embellishment, distilled into procedural clarity. His notes included: accidental fall precipitated by sudden shift in balance. Secondary head impact with metal bracket. Confession consistent with physical evidence, floor markings, and location of objects. Earlier presence of another individual not substantiated. Slide found deliberately placed in evidence box by Diana. Markings on frame belong to victim. He paused before writing the final line, letting his fingers hover over the keys. Case resolved based on newly surfaced evidence and confession. A simple sentence, mechanical, clean, accurate. But truth, real truth, rarely felt that neat. He closed the file. The room seemed quieter, though nothing had changed visibly. Outside, the city lights pressed against the dark with a kind of indifferent persistence. Snow continued to fall in small, soft fragments, layering over the street, the cars, the aging rooftops. He left the office and walked through the precinct hallway, each step echoing faintly. His coat hung loosely at his sides. He carried no triumph, no satisfaction, only a tired recognition of how long the past had waited to be acknowledged. The loft remained on his mind. Not the scene itself, but the impression it carried, the sense of a moment suspended for decades, waiting for someone to see it clearly. It reminded him that even in the most carefully documented cases, truth could hide in plain sight, muted beneath assumption, misinterpretation, or fear. Not concealed maliciously, just quietly, like dust settling in a room no one enters. At the building's exit, Rowan paused before pushing open the glass door. A reflection stared back at him, faint, slightly aged, softened at the edges by the glow of the overhead lights. Behind the reflection was the world outside, unchanged and unbothered by the resolution of one long-forgotten case. He stepped into the cold evening. Snow muffled the sound of traffic. The distant shapes of passing strangers blurred into one another, anonymous silhouettes moving at their own pace. Rowan walked without urgency, letting the muted city atmosphere accompany his thoughts. Justice had been served, technically. The paperwork would confirm that. Diana would face consequences appropriate for her role, not for malice but for long-held silence. The slide would be preserved, catalogued, filed into official history. Liora Halden's story would finally have an ending. Yet Rowan felt an unresolved thread within himself. Not doubt, not regret, something quieter, a recognition that cases don't always reveal the full emotional logic behind their facts. Two lives intersected one evening in 1996, each carrying invisible burdens, each misreading the other's intentions. And in that fragile overlap, a moment shifted, a life slipped, and a truth buried itself under layers of time. He thought of Liora's final words, "Keep it safe." A plea mistaken, reinterpreted, transformed into secrecy rather than clarity. A simple phrase that became the hinge on which decades of silence turned. Rowan reached the corner, the wind pressing lightly against his coat. A street lamp flickered overhead, casting brief intervals of shadow across the snow. He paused, hands in his pockets, letting the cold settle around him. Truth, he knew, wasn't always something bright or sharp. Sometimes it was muted, grainy, unfocused, like an old slide taken in fading light. It became clear only when examined slowly, patiently, with willingness to see beyond the obvious. Cases ended, files closed, reports were archived. But understanding, the humankind, didn't follow those same boundaries. Rowan turned toward the station again, watching the faint glow through its windows. Behind those walls were countless other stories, countless unanswered echoes waiting for someone to listen. He walked forward, the snow compressing softly beneath his steps, leaving a trail that the wind began to erase almost immediately. In the quiet of that New York night, the cold case was solved. But the silence it left behind lingered, an understated reminder that truth rarely announces itself loudly. It hides in the smallest details, revealed not by force but by attention. And sometimes, even when the facts align and justice is carried out, something human remains unresolved, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting for the next pair of careful eyes to see it.